Victor Hale didn't bother lowering his voice when he said it. He stood at the center of Blackthorn Ridge's only dry goods store, surrounded by three of his hired men, and he pointed at the woman stepping down from the wagon with all the casual cruelty of a man who had never once been told no. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Gideon finally ordered himself a mule." The laughter came fast, the kind that spreads before people even decide whether something is funny. A woman near the post office covered her mouth. Two ranch hands leaning against the feed store wall exchanged grins. Even the shopkeeper behind the counter found something very interesting to study on his shelf. Eliza Ward stood in the middle of that laughter and did not move. She had just traveled 11 days on a wagon that smelled like wet leather and old tobacco. She had eaten hardtack and dried beans for the last 4 of them. Her dress was wrinkled beyond saving, her boots were splitting at the left heel, and her hair had given up entirely somewhere around the second mountain pass. She was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, plain-faced, and completely alone in a town that had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. And Victor Hale was still grinning. If you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye in it decide you didn't belong, if you've ever had someone reduce everything you are to the way you look in a single sentence, then you already know what Eliza felt standing on that street. The question is, what would you have done next? Before we find out what Eliza Ward did, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. New episodes drop every week, and trust me, this one is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. If this story reaches you today, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this woman's story has already traveled. Now, let's go back to that street in Blackthorn Ridge, because what happened next is the reason nobody in that valley ever laughed at Eliza Ward a second time. The wagon driver didn't wait. He handed Eliza her bag. One bag, old brown leather, the strap repaired twice with different colored thread, dropped it at her feet, and clicked his horses forward before the dust had even settled. He had been paid to deliver her to Blackthorn Ridge. He had done that. Whatever came next was not his concern. Eliza picked up the bag herself. She didn't look around for help. She didn't look at Victor Hale, whose laughter was still trailing off in that self-satisfied way of men who expect applause. She looked at the street in front of her and took stock of what she was working with. A main road, unpaved, rutted from recent wagon traffic. A feed store, a dry goods counter, a blacksmith shed with the doors thrown open and the smell of hot iron coming through. A saloon, naturally, and beside it a narrow building with a painted sign she couldn't quite read from this distance. Maybe a telegraph office. Maybe a lawyer's. Hard to tell. The town was smaller than the advertisement had made it sound. Most things were. She had found the listing in a newspaper back in Pennsylvania, 3 weeks after the bank took what remained of her family's farm. The notice had been brief. Rancher in Blackthorn Ridge, Colorado Territory, seeks capable woman for marriage and household management. Hard work required. Inquire by letter to G. Cross, Box 7. She had written back the same evening, before she could talk herself out of it. She had told him exactly what she was, her age, her size, her situation, because she had decided that if she was going to do something this frightening, she was not going to begin it with a lie. She had received a single reply. It said, "Arrive 3rd week of October. I'll send someone to meet you at the Ridge Road." Nobody had met her at the Ridge Road. She had waited 2 hours in the cold before a passing supply wagon offered her a ride into town. So here she was. Victor Hale had moved on. She could hear his voice somewhere behind her now, talking to one of his men about cattle prices, apparently done with her as entertainment. That was fine. She had not come to Blackthorn Ridge to interest Victor Hale. She crossed the street toward the dry goods store and pushed open the door. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his 60s, with the kind of weathered face that meant he had spent at least half his life outdoors before deciding indoors suited him better. He looked up when she came in, and to his credit, he didn't immediately look away. "I'm looking for Cross Ranch," Eliza said. "I was told in my letter someone would meet me, but that didn't happen. Can you tell me how far it is and whether there's any way to get there that doesn't involve me walking?" The man studied her for a moment. "You the bride?" "I'm the woman Gideon Cross wrote to, yes." He made a small sound, Bob. Not quite a laugh, more like an exhale that had given up on being neutral. He's out at this north pasture. His hand Colby usually comes in for supplies on Thursdays. Today's Thursday. You could wait. How long? Could be an hour, could be 4. Eliza set her bag down on the floor and looked around the store. Flour, salt, canned goods, rope, candles. The basics of a life stripped to its necessary parts. Is there somewhere I can sit? She asked. There's a bench out front. The bench out front is where Victor Hale's men are standing. The shopkeeper had no answer for that. Eliza pulled a crate away from the wall and sat on it, folding her hands in her lap. I'll wait in here, she said. He let her. That was the first small kindness anyone in Blackthorn Ridge showed her, and she didn't forget it. Colby Hayes arrived 2 hours and 40 minutes later, which was closer to 4 than 1, and he came in talking before he was through the door. Patterson, tell me you got that axle grease in because Gideon's been on my case about the Southgate wagon since... He stopped when he saw Eliza. Looked at her. Looked at Patterson. Looked back at her. He was younger than she expected. Maybe 25, lean and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled by someone in a hurry. He wore his hat pushed back on his head in the way of men who wanted to look relaxed and were actually always watching. You the bride? He asked. That's the second time someone's asked me that today, Eliza said. I assume the answer is still yes. Colby Hayes did not smile. He looked her over the way you'd look over a piece of equipment you'd been told was serviceable but had your doubts about. She watched him do it and didn't say anything, because she had decided sometime around the second mountain pass that she was going to let people form their first impressions and then give them reason to form second ones. Wagon's out front, he said finally. I've got to load supplies. I'll help. He blinked. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She stood up and picked up her bag. You have more to carry than I do. I'll help. He didn't argue. She wasn't sure if that was because he was too surprised to or because he'd assessed the situation and concluded arguing would take longer than just letting her. Either way, they loaded the supply wagon together in the thin October sunlight, and Colby Hayes did not say another word to her for the first 20 minutes of the ride out to the ranch. She didn't mind. She was looking at the land. The valley was harder than she'd imagined it. Rockier. The grasses were pale and dry, beaten down by a season that had clearly not been generous. The mountains to the west were already showing snow on their upper faces, which meant winter wasn't a threat. It was an appointment that had already been made. She counted fence lines as they passed, noted which ones had posts leaning and which wire had been patched. She looked at the cattle in the north field, maybe 40 head visible, fewer than the advertisement had implied. And she looked at the water situation, which was a creek running low along the eastern edge of the property. How many head does the ranch run? She asked. Colby glanced at her sideways. Why? Because I'm going to be living here. I'd like to know what I'm living on. He was quiet for a moment. Gideon'll tell you what he wants you to know. All right, she said, and she kept looking at the land. Tup. Gideon Cross was not what the advertisement had suggested either. She had expected someone older, or at least someone who looked like the kind of man who would place an advertisement for a wife in a Pennsylvania newspaper. She had built a picture in her head, something like her father maybe, or the older farmers she'd grown up around. Steady men who kept their emotions behind a wall of practicality. Gideon was in his late 30s, dark-haired, with the look of a man who had been dealing with something exhausting for so long that the exhaustion had become his resting expression. He was standing at the fence of the south pasture when the wagon pulled in, and he watched her climb down without moving toward her. She walked to him and held out her hand. Eliza Ward, she said. He looked at her hand for a moment before he shook it. His grip was brief and businesslike. You made it, he said. I did. No one met me at the Ridge Road. Something crossed his face. Not quite guilt, but in the neighborhood of it. Colby was supposed to. I was loading grain, Colby said from behind her, in a tone that made clear this was an ongoing disagreement. Gideon looked at his ranch hand with the flat patience of a man who had said everything he was going to say about this subject and was done saying it. Then he looked back at Eliza. House is there, he said, nodding toward the low-roofed structure beyond the barn. Martha, she was my housekeeper, left in August. Kitchen's been running rough since then. I can manage a kitchen. It's not just the kitchen. The whole house has been running rough. Then I'll manage the whole house. He studied her for a long moment. She met his eyes and didn't look away, because she had already learned that the first place most people tried to defeat her was in that space, that held gaze where they waited for her to flinch. She didn't flinch. "All right," Gideon said. He turned back to the fence. "Supper's at 6. There are 2 hands who eat with us, Colby and an older man named Pete. They'll be in at 5:30. That was all. He turned back to whatever he'd been examining on the fence, and the conversation was apparently over. Eliza picked up her bag and walked to the house. Time. The kitchen was not rough. The kitchen was a catastrophe. Someone, probably Colby, she would later learn, had been cooking for the household since August, and his approach to cooking was apparently to use every pot once and then leave it on the stove in the hopes that the problem would resolve itself. The flour sack had been left open and had collected moisture and something that might have been mouse activity. The salt pork had been improperly wrapped. Half the canned goods were organized by no discernible system. The iron stove had grease on it that had been there long enough to develop a geological record. Eliza stood in the middle of it for about 30 seconds. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started working. She had 2 hours before supper. She used them. She couldn't fix everything. She didn't try to, but she fixed enough. She cleaned the stove surface, found flour that was still usable in the back of the lower cabinet, located a ham that was in better shape than it had any right to be, and put together a meal that was plain but hot and complete. When Pete came in at 5:30, a wiry man in his 60s with a white mustache and the careful movements of someone whose joints had been making complaints for years, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and sniffed. "Biscuits?" he said. "Sit down," Eliza said. He sat down. Colby came in behind him, still wearing his outdoor expression of low-level skepticism. He looked at the table, which was set properly for the first time in months, and then looked at Eliza with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite surprise, but was somewhere in the middle of both. "You made biscuits," he said. "Sit down," she said, same as she'd said to Pete. He sat down. Gideon came in last, quiet, barely tracking the room as he took his chair. But he tracked the table. She saw his eyes move across it, the set plates, the covered dish, the small things that meant someone had paid attention, and then he sat down without saying anything. They ate. It was not a warm meal, emotionally speaking. Pete was the only one who attempted conversation, and his attempts were gentle and not very persistent. Colby ate like a man who was waiting to find something to criticize and was irritated not to be finding it. Gideon ate like a man who was somewhere else entirely. At the end of the meal, Gideon put down his fork, looked at Eliza across the table, and said, "Better than I expected." She wasn't sure if he meant the food or her. "I'll need to take stock of the supplies tomorrow," she said, "and I'd like to know where the account book is kept. If I'm managing this household, I need to know what we're working with." A pause, not a comfortable one. "The account book's in my office," Gideon said. "I'd like access to it." Colby made a sound that was almost a snort. Gideon looked at her again with that same flat, measuring expression. She held it the same way she had at the fence. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no either. And Eliza had been surviving on things that weren't quite yes for most of her adult life. The first week was an education in what it meant to underestimate cold. She had grown up in Pennsylvania, which had winters, but this was different. The wind came down from the mountain at night with a personal intensity, as if it had specifically identified Cross Ranch as a target. The mornings began before light, which she expected, but they also began with water that had to be broken from ice in the basin, which she did not expect, and with the discovery that the house had a gap in the north-facing wall behind the pantry large enough to feel through. She caulked it herself, on the second morning, using materials she found in the barn because she did not yet know where else to look. Pete watched her do it with an expression of mild approval. Colby walked by, looked at what she was doing, and kept walking without commenting. She was learning Colby Hayes by what he didn't say. He didn't say she was doing the caulking wrong, which meant she was doing it right. He didn't say anything when she reorganized the pantry according to a system that made sense, or when she repaired the broken hinge on the back door with a spare pin she found in the tool drawer. He said nothing, which in Colby's language appeared to be acknowledgement. Gideon she was learning differently. He spoke little, but when he did, he was precise. He didn't waste words explaining himself. He said things once and expected them to be heard, which was actually a quality she found easier to work with than she'd expected. Her father had been a talker, Long explanations, repeated instructions, meandering through a point, and she'd spent years translating that into action. Gideon's directness was almost a relief. What wasn't a relief was the sense, growing steadily through the week, that something was wrong with the ranch that nobody was talking about. She saw it in small pieces at first. The cattle count that didn't match the numbers Pete let slip in conversation. The tense silence whenever the topic of the Eastern Creek came up. A letter that arrived on Thursday and that Gideon read at the kitchen table and then folded twice and put in his shirt pocket with the precise movements of a man containing a reaction. She said nothing about any of it. She kept working. On the 8th day, the ranch dog found her. He was a large, indeterminate-colored animal, brown, mostly, with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, who had apparently been living mostly outdoors since August and had developed a dim view of the situation. He appeared at the back door while she was washing the breakfast dishes, and he sat down and looked at her through the window with the patient certainty of an animal who has decided something and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. She opened the door. He came in, turned 2 circles near the stove for warmth, and lay down. "Ranger," Pete told her later when he saw the dog occupying the kitchen. "Gideon's dog. Hasn't come inside since Martha left." Eliza looked at the dog lying next to the stove with his chin on his paws and his eyes half closed. "Well," she said, "he came back in now." Pete was quiet for a moment, looking at her. He was not a sentimental man. She'd established that quickly enough. But there was something in the way he held that look, something careful and considering, that she filed away without comment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Someone who'd have cried by now," he said, "or someone who'd have left." "I'm not leaving," Eliza said. She said it plainly, without drama. But she meant every syllable of it with a steadiness that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with the simple fact that she had nowhere else to go and had decided to make that into a foundation rather than a trap. Pete nodded once and went back to his coffee. Ranger didn't move from beside the stove. And somewhere across the valley, Victor Hale was making a decision that would test every bit of that steadiness before the winter was through. The account book stayed in Gideon's office for 11 more days before Eliza got her hands on it. She didn't ask again. She had learned in the first week that asking Gideon Cross for something twice in quick succession was the surest way to make him dig in. He was not a man who responded well to pressure. He responded to evidence, to the demonstrated reality of a thing rather than the argument for it. So she went on demonstrating. She managed the kitchen with the flour and salt pork and canned goods she had, stretching meals in ways that didn't announce themselves as stretching. She repaired what she could repair without tools she didn't have. She kept the fire consistent through the night, which meant waking twice to feed it, which meant sleeping in pieces, which was not ideal but was manageable. She learned the rhythms of the household. When Pete's knees were bad enough to make the early morning feeding rounds genuinely difficult, when Colby was in the kind of mood that meant something had gone wrong with the cattle and he needed to be left alone to work through it, when Gideon had been up before 4 because she'd see the lamp already out in his office window when she rose at 5. She learned their patterns, and she fit herself around them without announcing that she was doing it, because she had understood since before she'd written that first letter, that the way to make herself necessary was not to argue for her necessity, but to become it quietly, one day at a time, until removing her would require a deliberate and uncomfortable act rather than simple indifference. It was not a noble strategy. She wasn't sure she'd call it a strategy at all. It was closer to survival. On the 19th day, Gideon left the office door open. She didn't know if it was intentional. He'd gone out to the south pasture after breakfast to deal with a fence line that had been giving trouble, and the door swung open in the draft from the back of the house. The same draft she still hadn't fully defeated despite her best efforts with the caulking. She stood in the hallway and looked at the open door for a moment. Then she went in. The account book was on the desk, which was not a surprise. What was a surprise was the state of the desk around it. She had assumed, based on Gideon's general precision of speech and movement, that his office would reflect the same quality. It did not. The desk was covered in papers, letters, receipts, what looked like survey documents, a copy of what might have been a water rights agreement, and the layered disorder of a man who had been too busy dealing with problems to file the records of them. She didn't touch anything except the account book. She carried it to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened it. She was not an accountant. She had never been trained in anything that could be called financial management. But she had run the books for her family's farm from the time she was 16, because her father was good with crops and animals and genuinely hopeless with numbers. And she had kept that farm solvent through 3 difficult years before the combination of drought and debt had finally ended it anyway. She knew how to read a ledger. She knew what healthy numbers looked like, and she knew what numbers that were being managed to look healthier than they were looked like too. Cross Ranch's numbers looked sick, not catastrophically, not the kind of sick that meant the end was already written, more like the kind of sick that meant someone had been bleeding slowly for long enough that they'd adjusted their expectations downward without quite realizing how far down they'd adjusted. Revenue from cattle sales was inconsistent in a way that didn't track with the notes Gideon had made in the margin about herd quality. The water usage costs were high, not dramatically, but persistently, in a way that nagged at her. And there were 3 payments in the last 8 months, each recorded simply as settlement, H, that had no further explanation. She was still looking at those 3 entries when she heard the back door. She didn't try to hide the book. She sat where she was and watched Gideon come in from the cold, pulling off his gloves, and she watched the moment he saw her at the table with his account book open in front of her. He stopped. The silence was the particular kind that has mass to it. "I went into your office," Eliza said. "The door was open. I should have asked before I touched anything on your desk. I'm telling you that directly because I'd rather you be angry at me for what I actually did than suspicious of me for something you're imagining." Gideon looked at her for a long time. The outdoor cold was still on him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the color at the edges of his face. "What did you find?" he said. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected anger, or at minimum a demand that she put it back. 3 payments, she said, labeled settlement, H. No amounts I can reconcile against anything else in here. And your water costs don't match your creek access. You're paying for water you should already own. Another silence. Longer this time. Gideon pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't take the book back. He looked at the table between them like a man deciding how much of a wall to leave standing. "H is Hale," he said. "Victor Hale." "What are you settling with him?" "Dispute over the eastern water line. He claims his deed predates mine on the creek access. My lawyer says otherwise. We've been—" He stopped. Started again. "It's been going on 2 years. And you've been paying him in the meantime. Partial payments. To keep him from filing an injunction while it works through." Eliza looked back at the ledger. 2 years of partial payments. The numbers reordered themselves in her head. What the ranch should have been generating, what it was generating, what had been quietly drained out of the gap between those 2 things. "That's not a settlement," she said. "That's a slow bleed." Gideon's jaw moved, just slightly. "I know what it is." "Does your lawyer know about all 3 payments?" "My lawyer is in Denver." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her directly then, not with anger exactly, but with the particular focus of a man who had just been asked a question he didn't want to answer honestly and was deciding whether to bother lying. "He knows about the first one," Gideon said. Eliza closed the account book. Not dismissively, carefully, the way you handle something you intend to come back to. "I'd like to keep looking at this," she said. "If you'll let me." "Why?" She thought about several answers. She chose the honest one. "Because I've got nothing else useful to do with my evenings, and because something in these numbers doesn't sit right, and because I'd rather find out I'm wrong than not look and find out later I was right." Gideon stared at her. It was the longest he'd looked directly at her since she'd arrived, and she understood without being told that this was not a man who looked at people for long, that holding someone's gaze was, for him, an expenditure of something he guarded. "Fine," he said. He stood up, pushed the chair back. "Keep it off the desk when you're not using it. Pete uses that table for his harness work in the afternoon." He went back out. Eliza sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, with the rangers breathing from beside the stove and the wind doing its usual work on the north wall, and she opened the account book again. What? She found the first real anomaly 4 days later, buried in a series of cattle sale receipts from the previous spring. The cattle had sold at a price that was, according to the margin notes Gideon had kept, below what the herd quality should have commanded. That wasn't unusual on its own. Markets moved, buyers were unpredictable, and ranchers often got less than they thought they deserved. But when she cross-referenced the sale receipts against Pete's offhand comments about that season, he talked in the evenings sometimes, not much, but enough. The herd that had gone to sale had been larger than what the receipts reflected. She went back further, found it again, less clearly, in the fall sale of the year before. She needed to understand the cattle auction system better, which meant she needed to ask someone, which meant she needed to pick her source carefully. Pete was honest but cautious. He would answer questions, but he'd answer them in the direction he thought she was already going, and she didn't want to be steered yet. Colby knew more than he let on, but Colby still hadn't fully decided what he thought of her, and she didn't want him carrying her questions to Gideon before she had something concrete to bring herself. She chose Pete. She waited until a Thursday evening when Colby was in town and Gideon had gone to check the north pasture fence by lantern, a sign that something had come up with the cattle she didn't know about yet. And she sat down across from Pete at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the specific look of a woman who is not asking casually. "Tell me how the cattle auction works," she said. Pete wrapped his hands around his cup. "Which part?" "The pricing. How does a buyer know what your cattle are worth before they bid?" "They don't exactly. They assess on the day, weight, condition, breed quality. The auction house sets a starting price based on what the seller registers." "And who does the registering?" "Seller's representative usually, or the seller himself if he's there." "What if the seller's representative is connected to the auction house?" Pete's hands tightened slightly on the cup. "Not much. Just enough." "That'd be a problem," he said. "A legal problem?" "Depends how you proved it." Eliza nodded slowly, looking at her coffee. "Has Gideon always used the same representative at the Blackthorn auction?" "Last 2 years he has. Man named Driscoll. Works for the auction house, but takes independent clients too." "And who recommended Driscoll to him?" Pete was quiet for a moment. He had a way, when something landed on him that he needed to think about, of becoming very still. Not uncomfortable, just still. Like an animal that has heard something in the underbrush and is taking its time before it reacts. "Victor Hale," Pete said. Eliza looked up. Pete looked back at her. "I'm going to need to see the survey maps," she said. "Those would be in Gideon's office." "Yes," she said. They would be. She didn't go to the office that night. She waited until Gideon came back in from the north pasture. It was past 9, which told her the cattle problem was more than routine. And she was still in the kitchen when he came through the door looking cold and tired and something else underneath those that she was beginning to recognize as worry that had been living in him long enough to go quiet. She poured him coffee without being asked. It was not a romantic gesture. It was the gesture of someone who has assessed that another person is cold and tired and that warm coffee addresses both. He sat down. "One of the heifers is showing signs of something I don't like," he said. "Not to her exactly, more to the room. Pete'll need to check her in the morning." "I'll tell him." Gideon drank the coffee. Outside, the wind found a new angle on the house and tested it. "I found something in the accounts," Eliza said. He looked at her. She told him what she'd found, not as an accusation and not as a theory, because she didn't have enough yet for a theory. She gave him the specific numbers, the specific dates, the specific discrepancy between Pete's recollections and what the receipts showed. She told him about Driscoll. She watched his face while she did. His face didn't change much, but his hands, which had been loose around the coffee cup, went still. "Hale recommended Driscoll," Gideon said when she finished. Pete confirmed it. A long pause. The fire in the stove settled. "I knew something was wrong with the spring sales," Gideon said. "I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it was me, that I'd overestimated the herd." "You hadn't." "I don't know that yet." "No," Eliza said, "but I'd like to. Can I look at the survey maps?" He didn't answer right away. I was looking at the table again, in that way of his, like the surface of it was something he was thinking through rather than seeing. "Hale's been pushing on the Eastern Waterline for 2 years," he said. "Lawyers, pressure, the settlement payments. I thought that was the whole of it." "I think the waterline is just the part he put in front of you," Eliza said carefully. "I think there might be more behind it." The silence that followed was different from the others. It had the particular quality of a silence in which someone is reassembling their understanding of a problem they thought they knew. "Survey maps are in the bottom left drawer," Gideon said. "The one that sticks. You have to lift the handle slightly when you pull." The maps were old and detailed and covered in the kind of handwritten notations that accumulated over decades of use by men who were too busy to keep clean records and too careful to throw any of it away. Eliza spread them on the kitchen table the following morning before anyone else was up, and she stayed there until the light was good enough to read the fine lines without straining. The Eastern Creek ran across the northeastern corner of Cross Ranch land, fed from a source higher up in the mountain that predated any of the valley settlements. The original deed, granted 23 years ago to Gideon's father, included explicit water rights language. She found it on the third page of the property documents she'd found folded with the maps. The kind of language that had probably been written by someone careful, because it was specific about flow rate and seasonal access and third-party claims. Victor Hale's claim, from what she could reconstruct, was based on a deed amendment filed 6 years ago, which predated Gideon's ownership. His father had died and the property had transferred to Gideon 5 years ago, but postdated the original deed by 17 years. She didn't know enough about land law to know what that meant precisely, but she knew enough to know that a deed amendment filed after an original grant was not automatically superior to that grant, and she knew that the lawyer in Denver had apparently not been shown the original deed language because the settlement payments Gideon had been making were exactly the kind of concession you made when you weren't confident in your own paperwork. Gideon came in at 5:30 and found her still at the table. He looked at the spread of documents and maps without saying anything. "Your original deed is solid," Eliza said. "Or it looks solid to me, which isn't the same thing, but it's enough that your lawyer in Denver should have been waiving this at Hale's lawyer a year and a half ago instead of negotiating settlements." Gideon poured his own coffee this time. He stood at the stove with it. "The lawyer in Denver told me the original language was ambiguous," he said. "Did he show you specifically where?" "No." "Did you ask?" Gideon didn't answer. That was an answer. "I think," Eliza said, choosing her words, "that you need a different lawyer. Lawyers cost money." "Yes. Less than 2 years of settlement payments, though, if you add them up." He turned and looked at her. Something in his face had shifted slightly from the night before, or maybe it had been shifting since she'd walked into the kitchen that first evening with a meal that was better than anyone expected, and she was only now able to read the degree of it. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was more like the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and is experiencing the complicated and not entirely comfortable sensation of someone else putting their hands on the other end of it. "What else?" he said. "The auction representative, Driscoll. I want to know if he's connected to Hale beyond the recommendation. That's going to take more than account books." "How would you find out?" "Public records. Incorporation filings, if there are any. Anyone who does business in the territory has to file somewhere. I'll need to go into town." Colby's voice came from the hallway. He'd been listening, apparently, for at least the last part of this. "You want to go into town and dig through filing records." He appeared in the doorway, not bothering to look like he hadn't been eavesdropping. "For what? You don't even know what you're looking for." "I'll know it when I find it," Eliza said. "That's not a plan. It's more of a plan than paying a man every month to go away and watching him not go away." Colby's mouth tightened, but he didn't have an answer for it, which was becoming something of a pattern. Gideon set down his coffee cup. "Pete's in this morning," he said to Colby. "Check the heifer first, then take the wagon to Patterson's for the supplies we need." He looked at Eliza. "You can ride in with him." Colby started to say something. "Ride in with her," Gideon said, and his tone had a finality to it that even Colby, who had strong feelings about most things, chose not to test. Colby drove the wagon into Blackthorn Ridge with the rigid posture of a man who has been told to do something he objects to and has decided to perform his objection through his spine. Eliza sat beside him and did not attempt conversation. She watched the land go by, the frost still on the grass, the mountains catching the morning light in a way that would have been beautiful if she weren't too busy thinking about water rights and auction fraud. They were 4 miles out of town when Colby spoke. "You really think Hale's been cheating the cattle prices?" "I think someone has." "Driscoll works for the auction house. He'd lose his position if anyone could prove it." "Only if someone looked." Colby chewed on the side of his cheek, which she'd learned was what he did when he was thinking something through that he didn't want to give the impression of thinking through. "Patterson keeps old auction records," he said. "He's the area agent for the cattle registry. He's got copies of all the filed sale sheets from the last decade." Eliza turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. Patterson's a straight man, he said. Always has been. He doesn't like Hale. Would he let me look? Probably, if you asked straight. She nodded, looked back at the road ahead. I'm not trying to make trouble for the ranch, she said. I know, Colby said. And the way he said it, flat, a little grudging, but without the hard skepticism of his earlier weeks, told her that something had shifted between them that neither of them was going to make a ceremony of. They didn't speak again for the rest of the ride, which was fine. Some things were better left at their natural size. Patterson had the records. He brought them out of the back room in 2 stacked boxes without much preamble. She'd explained what she was looking for, and he'd gone to get them the way a man does when he's been waiting for someone to ask the right question. He set them on the counter, cleared a space, and went back to his regular work with the pointed discretion of a man who wanted it understood that he had not been part of whatever she was doing. Eliza worked through the records for 2 hours. She found what she was looking for in the 3rd box, a series of sales sheet duplicates for the Blackthorn Ridge Fall auction, 3 years running. The filed amounts were lower than the registration amounts on 2 of the 3 years. Not by much. Enough to be explained away as clerical error on either one alone. Together, across 3 years, it was a pattern. And on the bottom of each adjusted sheet, the same initials in the verification column, DHD for Driscoll. She checked the official auction house roster, which Patterson kept filed separately. Driscoll's full name was Daniel Harwood Driscoll. DH. She sat with that for a moment. Then she looked at the incorporation records Colby had mentioned. Patterson had those too, in a separate ledger, territory business filings, updated annually. She found the Blackthorn Valley Water and Land Consortium, filed 4 years ago, and she found its listed principals. Victor Hale was first. Daniel H. Driscoll was third. She sat very still. The consortium had been filing for expanded water rights access across the valley for the past 3 years. The filings were careful, incremental, each one small enough to look routine, but stacked together, laid over the survey maps she still had in her memory from that morning at the kitchen table. She could see the shape of what they were doing. They were drawing a line. Slowly, legally, using every instrument available to them, they were drawing a line that would eventually run across every ranch in the valley and give them control of every water source above the southern ridge. Gideon's Eastern Creek was not a dispute over an old deed. It was the first acquisition. She was still standing at Patterson's counter, the paper spread in front of her, when the door of the store opened and Victor Hale walked in. He didn't see her immediately. He was talking to one of his men, the same easy volume he'd used on the street when she'd arrived. And he came through the door with the unhurried confidence of a man who considered most spaces his by default. Then he saw her, and he saw the papers on the counter. His expression didn't change much. That was the thing about men like Victor Hale. They'd had long enough to practice not reacting that the practice had become the reflex. He looked at her and at the papers, and he put together enough of what he was seeing to understand that something had changed. "Mrs. Cross," he said. He'd started calling her that in town, in a way she'd noticed was slightly different from how anyone else said it. Just a fraction more emphasis on the Mrs., like a reminder of the category she occupied. "Mr. Hale," she said. He moved toward the counter, not quickly, and she watched him assess the papers with the peripheral attention of someone trying to read without appearing to read. "Doing some research," he said. "Just getting familiar with how things work around here," she said. She began folding the papers back the way she'd found them. Not hurrying, deliberately not hurrying. "I'm still new to the territory, a lot to learn." "Indeed." He watched her hands. "I hope Gideon's treating you well. It's not an easy situation, coming into a household like that." "It's fine," she said. "He's a good man." Something moved behind Hale's eyes at that. Not quite surprise, reassessment. "Well," he said, "if there's anything you need. My operation's the largest in the valley. Happy to be a resource." "That's very kind," Eliza said. She finished refolding the last document, squared the stack, and said to Patterson at the back, "Thank you. I'll leave these as I found them." Patterson, without turning around, "Appreciated." She picked up her bag and walked past Victor Hale toward the door. "Enjoying the valley?" he said behind her. She stopped with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. "Very much," she said. She went out. Colby was loading the supply wagon when she came across the street, and he took one look at her face and said, "You found something." "I found a lot," she said quietly. "And Hale just walked in and saw me looking at it." Colby's hands went still on the sack he was lifting. "Did he? He doesn't know specifically what I found, but he knows I was looking." She helped him lift the sack into the wagon bed without being asked. "We need to get back." "Gideon needs to know tonight." "Yes." They were out of town and back onto the ridge road before Colby spoke again. When he did, his voice had a different quality than the journey in. Not soft exactly, but without the hard surface he'd been carrying since October. "I should have looked harder at Driscoll 2 years ago," he said. "I didn't like the man. I said it once, and Gideon said it was personal bias, and I let it go." "You couldn't have known," Eliza said. "Maybe." He kept his eyes on the road. "But I knew something was off. I wasn't looking the right way." Eliza thought about the right way to look at things. The way you had to come at a problem from an angle that wasn't the obvious one, because the obvious angles were often the ones that had been blocked on purpose. "You told me about Patterson," she said. "About the records." That mattered. Colby didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What are you going to tell Gideon?" "Everything," she said. "All of it. The auction sheets, the consortium, the water filings." Hale's face when he saw me at the counter. "He's going to want to do something immediately." "I know." "And you think he should wait?" She looked at him. It was smarter than he let on, which was probably something he'd developed deliberately, same way she'd developed the habit of letting people underestimate her. "We need more before he moves," she said. "Hale knows I was looking. If Gideon confronts him now without enough documentation to back it, Hale will bury what he can, and it'll be Gideon's word against his. We need copies of the relevant filings, and we need to talk to someone who understands land law, not a lawyer who's apparently been content to let his client keep writing checks." Colby nodded slowly. "There's a man in Fort Ridge. Not a lawyer exactly. He was a land claims adjudicator for the territory. Retired. He helped old Bauer with a water dispute 3 years back, and Bauer won." "Does he know Hale?" "Everybody in this valley knows Hale." "Does he owe him anything?" "No," Colby said. "And that's worth something." The ranch came into view ahead of them. The low roof line, the barn, the pale smoke from the kitchen chimney that meant Pete had kept the fire going. Ranger was probably still beside the stove. The heifer was probably either better or worse than last night, and Gideon was probably with her, carrying his worry the way he carried everything, quietly and alone. Not for much longer, Eliza thought. Not if she could help it. She looked at the road ahead and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, and not confidence, because she knew better than to mistake finding a problem for solving it. What she felt was more like purpose. The clean, focused quality of knowing that you are doing the right thing, not because it is safe or comfortable or guaranteed, but because it is the only thing worth doing with the time you have. She had come to Blackthorn Ridge with one bag, and no certainty about any of it. She hadn't come for comfort or affection or any of the softer things people sometimes let themselves imagine when they answered an advertisement in a newspaper. She had come because she could work and she could learn, and she had decided that she would not let other people's small expectations become the walls of her life. What was coming was going to be hard. She didn't minimize that. Victor Hale was not a man who let go of things easily, and he had resources and connections and 2 years of legal maneuvering already behind him. She had a stack of documents she'd memorized, a retired land adjudicator she hadn't yet spoken to, a ranch hand who'd decided to stop being her obstacle, and a rancher who had finally, reluctantly, let her put her hands on the other end of what he'd been carrying. It wasn't much. It was more than she'd had when she got off that wagon. The horses pulled them through the front gate of Cross Ranch, and Eliza Ward began thinking about what she was going to say to Gideon Cross when she sat down across that kitchen table and told him the truth about what was being done to everything he'd built. Gideon listened without interrupting, which was what she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was the stillness of him. Not the stillness of a man who was shutting down, but something more like the stillness of a man who had finally been handed the shape of a thing he'd been trying to see in the dark for 2 years. She laid it out in the order she'd found it. The auction sheets first, the adjusted figures, the initials in the verification column, then the incorporation filing, the Blackthorn Valley Water and Land Consortium, the list of principals. Then the water rights filings, the incremental pattern of them, the way they mapped against the valley survey when you laid them side by side in your head. She told him about Hale walking into Patterson's store and the way Hale had looked at the papers and what that look meant in practical terms for how much time they had before he moved to cover what he could. She talked for 20 minutes. Gideon sat with his coffee and didn't touch it. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet enough that they could hear Pete moving around in the barn across the yard, the dull thud of his work carrying through the cold. "He's been doing this for 3 years, Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "At least 3. Maybe longer, depending on when the consortium started operating before it formally filed. And Driscoll." He said the name like something he was tasting for the first time and finding exactly as bad as he'd feared. Every auction, every season. 2 confirmed years of adjusted sheets. Possibly 3. The earliest records Patterson had were incomplete. Gideon stood up. He went to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the dark yard. His shoulders had a particular set to them that she'd come to recognize. Not anger exactly, but something that was anger's more controlled and therefore more dangerous neighbor. "I sat across from that man at the auction house twice," he said, shook his hand. "He's been doing this to every rancher in the valley, not just you," Eliza said. "You're the most visible because you're fighting him on the waterline. The others probably don't even know yet what's happening to them." Gideon turned around. "How do you know the others are affected?" "Because the consortium's water filings don't just cover your creek. They cover the Bauer property to the north and the Mercer grazing land on the western ridge. If those filings succeed, Hale controls every water source above the southern ridge by spring." The word spring landed in the room with weight. Spring was 4 months away. That was not very much time. "Colby mentioned a man," Eliza said, "in Fort Ridge, a retired land claims adjudicator who helped the Bauers 3 years ago." "Emery Fitch," Gideon said immediately. "I know of him." "Can you get to him?" "It's a day's ride." "I know." He looked at her. That long, measuring look she'd grown more familiar with over the weeks. It had changed in quality, she thought, from the first days. Early on, it had carried a faint undercurrent of something like doubt. Not cruelty, just the honest uncertainty of a man who had agreed to something sight unseen and wasn't yet sure what he'd agreed to. That quality was gone now. What was there instead was harder to name. Attention, maybe. The specific quality of attention you gave to someone you had decided was worth paying attention to. "You think we should move before Hale does," he said. "I think we have a narrow window. If he gets in front of this, if he files anything that supersedes the consortium documents I found, or if Driscoll adjusts the existing records, what I saw today becomes harder to use." "I can leave for Fort Ridge at first light. Take Colby," she said. "He knows Fitch's reputation. It'll help." Gideon nodded. He pulled his coat from the hook by the door. "I'll tell Colby tonight." He was halfway to the door when he stopped. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the frame, not quite turning back to her. "You didn't have to do this," he said. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement of something he didn't quite have the language for yet. "Yes, I did," she said. He went out. Okay. They left before dawn, Gideon and Colby, taking the stronger horses and moving fast enough that the sound of them faded from the yard before the sky had started to lighten. Pete watched them go from the barn doorway and then looked at Eliza on the porch. "He tell you what he's after?" Pete asked. "Enough." Pete pulled his coat closer. "Hale's not going to take this lying down. When he figures out what Gideon's doing, he'll move." "I know." "What are you going to do while they're gone?" Eliza looked at the yard, at the frost on the ground, at the thin pre-dawn dark that was just beginning to separate itself into objects you could name. "Make copies," she said. She spent the day at the kitchen table with pen and paper, working from memory. The auction figures, the consortium filings, the water rights applications, the correlating survey map coordinates she'd noted while looking at the maps that first morning. She couldn't reproduce the original documents, but she could produce a detailed account of their contents, with enough specificity that a land claims adjudicator would understand what she was describing. She organized it by category, then by date, and when she was finished, she had 8 pages of close-written notes that she folded and placed inside the cover of the account book, because that was where they'd look least out of place. Ranger lay under the table while she worked, breathing slow and even, occasionally shifting against her feet. She was on the 6th page when she heard a horse in the yard. She looked up. The window told her nothing from where she sat. She listened. One horse, not two, so not Gideon and Colby returning. Pete had gone out to the north pasture 2 hours ago and wasn't due back until late afternoon. She capped the pen, slid her notes inside the account book, stood up. The knock on the door was the knock of someone who had decided they were allowed to knock rather than someone asking permission. She opened the door. It was one of Hale's men. She recognized him from the day she'd arrived, one of the 3 who'd been standing with Hale outside the dry goods store. He was younger than she'd registered then, maybe 22, with the look of someone hired more for his willingness to show up than for any particular skill. "Mr. Hale's compliments," he said, and held out an envelope. Eliza took it, looked at it. Her name was written on the front in careful clerk's handwriting. Not Hale's hand, she suspected, but someone he employed for correspondence. "He's asking for a reply," the young man said. "Tell him I'll need to read it first." She didn't move from the doorway, didn't invite him in. He stayed on the porch, which was where she intended him to stay, while she opened the envelope and read what was inside. It was brief. Victor Hale, in the formal language of a man who had a lawyer write his threatening letters, expressed his concern about certain misunderstandings that had apparently developed regarding the Blackthorn Valley water rights dispute, and his hope that a private meeting between himself and the Cross household might allow those misunderstandings to be resolved before they progressed in an unfortunate direction. He proposed the following Thursday, at his property. Eliza folded the letter. "Tell Mr. Hale," she said, "that Mr. Cross is currently traveling on ranch business and will respond when he returns." The young man looked slightly uncomfortable. He was expecting. "I understand what he was expecting," she said. "Tell him what I said." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the horse leave the yard, and she thought about Victor Hale sitting in whatever room he used for thinking about his plans, deciding what her response meant. He would read it correctly, she suspected. He was not a stupid man. He would know that Gideon was not out on ordinary ranch business, and he would begin calculating accordingly. The window was narrowing. She had known that. Knowing it didn't make it more comfortable. She went back to the kitchen and uncapped the pen and finished her notes. Gideon and Colby returned on the second evening, later than expected, and they came back with a man she hadn't met. Emery Fitch was somewhere in his late 60s, compact and careful, with the alert eyes of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between what people said and what they meant. He had a leather satchel over one shoulder and the slightly dusty look of a man who had been moving fast. He came into the kitchen, looked at the papers Eliza had spread out, and sat down without waiting to be invited. "You're the one who found the consortium filing," he said. "Yes." "Tell me exactly what you saw, not what you concluded. What you saw." She told him. He listened the way Gideon listened, without interrupting, without indicating whether he agreed or disagreed, just absorbing. When she finished, he opened his satchel and produced documents of his own. She could see from where she stood that some of them were official territory stamps. "I've been watching the consortium filings for 2 years, Fitch said. Couldn't prove intent. Individual filings were too small, too spread out. What you found, the auction records, the Driscoll connection, that's the connective tissue." "Is it enough?" Gideon asked. Fitch looked at the papers on the table. "To challenge the water rights filings, yes. To open an investigation into the auction fraud, possibly. It depends on what the Territory Land Office decides to do with it." "What would make it stronger?" Eliza asked. Fitch looked at her with the slightly appraising expression of someone recalibrating. "Other ranchers," he said. "If the Bowers and the Mercers can show the same pattern in their cattle sales, adjusted auction sheets, the same representative, it stops being one rancher's complaint and becomes a valley-wide fraud case. That's different. That's the kind of thing the territory has to respond to." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The Bowers and Mercers don't know any of this yet." "No," Eliza said. "But they will." She looked at Gideon. "The cattle auction is in 3 weeks." The room was quiet. Fitch looked between them. "The annual Blackthorn Ridge auction," he said slowly. "Every rancher in the valley will be there," Eliza said. "Every landowner, every person affected by what Hale is doing. It's also the venue where Hale will try to consolidate his position," Fitch said. "If he's moving, And from what you're describing, he is. The auction is where he'll do it publicly. Make announcements, demonstrate control, let people see the shape of the thing so they know resisting is futile. He paused. It's also the one place where every person who should hear the evidence will be in the same room. Gideon looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. We have 3 weeks, she said. Well, the 3 weeks were the hardest she'd spent at Cross Ranch, and that was not a low bar. Fitch stayed in the valley, working out of a room at the Blackthorn Ridge boarding house, and he and Eliza spent 3 long days going through documents and building the clearest possible picture of the consortium's operations. It was painstaking work, the kind that required holding 6 different threads in your head simultaneously without letting any of them go slack. And Fitch turned out to be both exacting and impatient in roughly equal measure, which she found she could work with because she was the same. Colby rode out to the Bauer property on the second day. He came back with old Hendrik Bauer's cattle sale records from the past 4 years and a look on his face that confirmed what Eliza had suspected. Same adjusted sheets, Colby said. Different amounts, but the same pattern. And Bauer says Driscoll handled all his auction filings. Does Bauer know what it means? He does now. Colby set the records on the table. He's angry. That man is very quietly, very angry. Is he willing to let us use his records? He said, Colby thought for a moment, getting the words right. He said he'd spent 60 years building something, and he wasn't going to let it be stolen from him by a man in a clean suit. Eliza filed that away alongside the copy of the consortium documents, the adjusted auction sheets, the water rights filings, and the detailed account she'd written from memory. The pile was growing. It was not yet large enough. She rode out to the Mercer property herself 2 days later. Margaret Mercer ran the Western Ridge grazing land with her son after her husband had died the previous spring. She was a practical woman in her 50s who met Eliza at the door of her house with the wariness of someone who'd had enough surprises in the last year to last her several lifetimes. Eliza respected that. She didn't preamble. She explained what she'd found and what it meant for the Mercer water access rights within the first 5 minutes. And she watched the wariness in Margaret's face convert, not into warmth, but into a harder and more useful expression. I knew something was wrong, Margaret said. The water flow from the upper creek has been inconsistent for a year. My son thought we were imagining it. You weren't imagining it, Eliza said. Margaret got her records. Victor Hale moved on the Thursday before the auction. He didn't come himself. He sent his lawyer, a man named Pierce from Durango, who wore his city clothes with the slight self-consciousness of someone who'd been told to present well. And Pierce arrived at Cross Ranch with a document that was, in the formal language of territory law, a demand for final settlement of the water rights dispute. The terms were simple. Gideon Cross would sign over access rights to the Eastern Creek in exchange for the cessation of legal proceedings and the forgiveness of the existing settlement debt. If he didn't sign within 7 days, Hale would file a motion with the Territory Land Office that would freeze all water usage on the property pending adjudication, which could take, Pierce said carefully, up to 18 months. 18 months without reliable water access. No cattle operation survived the kitchen table with the manner of a man who considered the outcome settled. Gideon looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Eliza. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Gideon looked back at Pierce. Tell Mr. Hale we'll have a response for him at the auction. Pierce blinked. The deadline is 7 days from... The auction is in 4 days, Gideon said. We'll have a response then. Mr. Cross, I must advise you that failing to respond within the specified time... I heard you, Gideon said. We'll have a response at the auction. Pierce left with the document unsigned and the stiff gait of a man who had expected a shorter meeting. Colby, who had been in the doorway for the last part of this, looked at Gideon. You know that gives Hale 4 days to prepare. We've had 3 weeks, Gideon said. He looked at Eliza again. Is it enough? She thought about everything they had. The consortium filings. The adjusted auction sheets from 3 ranches across 3 years. Fitch's legal analysis of the original water rights deed. The incorporation documents naming Driscoll as a consortium principal. Her 8 pages of detailed notes, now supplemented by Fitch's own documentation. She thought about the gaps, the things she couldn't prove beyond what she had, the places where a good lawyer could argue ambiguity, the possibility that Hale had already begun moving records she hadn't seen. It's enough to make him answer for it, she said. It might not be enough to win everything in one day. What does that mean in practice? It means we go to the auction with what we have. We put it in front of everyone at once, so Hale can't manage who hears it and when. We force him to respond publicly, and we make it clear to every rancher in that valley that they're part of this whether they knew it or not. She paused. And we need Fitch there, because he's the one person in the room who can translate what we have into language the Territory Land Office has to act on. And if Hale comes in with his own lawyers, he will. He'll have Pierce and whoever else he can get there in 4 days. She looked at the table, the account book, the map she'd referenced so many times it had developed a crease along the fold she kept opening. We're not trying to beat his lawyers. We're trying to make sure the truth is in the room before he can control the room. Gideon was quiet. Pete, from his chair by the stove, spoke up for the first time since Pierce had left. He'd been so still that she'd half forgotten he was there, which was probably exactly what he intended. Victor Hale has been the biggest man in this valley for 15 years, Pete said. Not because he's smarter than anyone, because everyone was afraid and no one had enough to fight him with. He looked at Eliza, direct and brief. Now someone does. Nobody said anything for a moment. Ranger shifted under the table, his tail hitting the floor once, twice, then settling. 4 days, Gideon said. The night before the auction, Eliza sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed and went through the documents one final time. Not because she might have missed something. She hadn't missed anything. She'd been through it enough times that she could have reproduced most of it from memory in the dark. She went through it because she had learned, in the weeks since she'd arrived at this table with an account book and a growing unease, that there was a difference between knowing something and being certain enough of it to stand up in a room full of people and say it out loud. She needed to be certain. The Eastern Creek deed language was solid. Fitch had confirmed it in writing, with specific reference to the territory statute under which it had been granted. Hale's consortium filing was based on the 6-year-old deed amendment, which, and this was the part Fitch had been methodical about proving, had been filed using a description of the water source that didn't match the original survey coordinates. The amendment described a different location. Not by much. Enough. The auction fraud was more complicated because Driscoll was still technically an employee of the auction house, and the adjusted sheets could be argued as clerical errors, individually. Collectively, across 3 properties, across multiple seasons, with the same initials in the verification column, they were not clerical errors. They were a pattern. And the pattern, laid against the consortium's water expansion filings, showed a shape that was not coincidence. She closed the last document. She sat for a while with Ranger's warm weight against her feet and the fire burning low in the stove. She thought about her family's farm in Pennsylvania. The way it had looked in autumn, before everything came apart. The fields turning, the work of the season complete, the brief and honest satisfaction of a harvest. She hadn't let herself think about it much since she'd left, because there was a difference between remembering something and carrying it like an injury, and she had enough to carry without adding grief to the weight. But she let herself think about it now. The farm had been taken from her family not by drought or disease, but by debt, which had been taken on in good faith and managed as well as they could manage it, and had still ended in the bank's favor. Nobody had done anything wrong, exactly. Nobody had done anything right enough. And there was a version of her that had been shaped by that, a version that expected unfairness, that had accepted somewhere deep down that the large structures of things were designed for people other than her, and that her role was to work within whatever was left over and be grateful for it. She had carried that version of herself onto the wagon and across 11 days of hard travel and into a town that laughed at her before she'd opened her mouth. What she had found at Cross Ranch, in the account book, in the records, in the slow accumulation of evidence that someone had been quietly stealing from these people for years, had done something to that version of herself, not replaced it, not erased the habit of expecting less than she deserved, but it had given the other version of her, the one that noticed things, that looked at numbers and found what didn't add up, that believed problems could be addressed if you were willing to look at them directly. It had given that version something to stand on. Tomorrow she was going to stand on it in front of everyone. She wasn't certain she wouldn't be shaking when she did. She wasn't certain it would be enough. She was certain she was going to do it, and she was certain of what she'd found. And in her experience, those 2 certainties, held together, were the most anyone could take into a hard room. She banked the fire. She went to bed. The annual Blackthorn Ridge cattle auction was held in the large open building at the south end of town that served, depending on the season, as a meeting hall, a grain storage space, and once, according to Pete, an emergency hospital during a difficult winter. On auction day, it was transformed by the sheer number of people it attracted. Ranchers from across the valley, buyers from 2 territories, representatives of the various businesses that depended on the cattle trade, and the general population of Blackthorn Ridge, which found the auction a reliable occasion for gathering. They arrived with an hour to spare, Gideon and Colby and Pete and Eliza, in the ranch wagon with the documents in a leather case that Gideon had produced from the bottom of the desk drawer with the air of a man who had not used it in some time. Fitch was already there. She could see him near the back wall, talking to a man she didn't recognize, making no effort to look like he was positioned strategically, which was exactly what he was doing. The Bowers came in 20 minutes later. Hendrik Bauer was a large, deliberate man in his 70s who moved through the crowd without particular haste and found his way to Gideon's side with the bearing of someone who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. He shook Gideon's hand and then, after a brief pause, shook Eliza's. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Thank you for coming," she said. "My family has been in this valley since before that man's father ever set foot here," Bauer said. He didn't have to say which man he meant. "I came because it's past time." Margaret Mercer arrived 10 minutes after that, with her son beside her. She found Eliza without looking around for her, as if she'd already mapped the room before she entered, which Eliza suspected she had. "How do you want to do this?" Margaret asked quietly. "Fitch will speak first," Eliza said. "He has legal standing to present the water rights challenge. After that we show them the auction records." "Yes." Margaret nodded. Her son, he was young, maybe 19, with his mother's direct eyes, looked like he was trying very hard to appear calm, which was the same thing Eliza was doing, so she felt a certain sympathy. Victor Hale arrived at the precise moment that suggested he had timed it. He came in with Pierce and 2 other men she didn't know, lawyers, probably, or men dressed to look like it, and he surveyed the room with the practiced ease of someone who considered the space already his. He saw Gideon. He saw Fitch. He saw, with a slight adjustment in his expression that she caught because she was watching for it, Eliza. His eyes rested on her for a moment. Then he moved toward his usual position near the front of the auction floor. The auction master called the room to order. The first hour was ordinary auction business, cattle lots, opening bids, the familiar machinery of a market day that had been running in this valley for 2 decades. Eliza sat still and kept her hands quiet in her lap and watched the room and thought about the moment. Victor Hale made his move in the second hour. He rose before the auction master could call the next lot and addressed the room with the casual authority of a man who had done this before. Explained that he had an announcement of significance to the valley's water management situation, referred to ongoing legal proceedings he expected to conclude shortly, and outlined, in terms that were careful enough to seem reasonable and broad enough to obscure what they meant, the terms under which the Blackthorn Valley Water and Land Consortium intended to assume management of the Upper Ridge water sources. He made it sound like public service. He made it sound like something done for the valley's benefit. 2 ranchers in the 3rd row were already looking uncertain in a way that meant they were considering not being in opposition to this. Eliza stood up. She did not have the practiced ease of someone who had addressed rooms before. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which she chose to accept as useful information about herself. "Mr. Hale," she said, "before you continue, I'd like to ask Emery Fitch to speak to the water rights question, given that he has reviewed the original deed documentation and has specific findings relevant to what you're describing." The room had gone quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting, the sharper quiet of people who had sensed something shift. Hale looked at her. His expression was controlled in the way that required effort. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "this is a business matter, and I don't believe—" "The consortium's expansion filing is a public matter," Fitch said, standing from the back of the room. He had the particular quality of a man who had spent decades in rooms where authority was contested and had no interest in performing calm. He simply was calm, in the way of someone for whom competence was sufficient. The water rights deed for Cross Ranch predates the consortium's amendment filing by 17 years. I've reviewed both documents. The amendment was filed against survey coordinates that don't match the original grant. He paused. That's not a legal dispute. That's an error in the filing. a correctable one, with the right documentation. But the current filing is not valid grounds for the access management structure Mr. Hale is describing. The two ranchers in the third row were no longer looking uncertain. They were looking at Hale. Hale's lawyer, Pierce, was already on his feet, beginning the business of objecting on technical grounds, and for a moment the room divided between the authority of his legal language and the simple weight of what Fitch had just said. Into that division, Eliza spoke again. "There's a second matter," she said. She looked at Hendrik Bauer, and Bauer stood. "My cattle sale records," Bauer said, in the voice of a man who did not raise it because he had never needed to, "show adjustments to the filed sale sheets over 3 years that were made without my knowledge or authorization. The adjustments reduced my documented sale amounts by a consistent margin. The verification initials on the adjusted sheets belong to Daniel Driscoll, who is listed as the third principal of Mr. Hale's consortium." The room moved. Not physically, but she could feel it, the change in the air, the recalibration happening simultaneously in 30 different people. Margaret Mercer stood without being introduced. "My records show the same," she said. Gideon Cross, beside Eliza, had not moved or spoken. He was looking at Victor Hale across the crowded room with an expression that had no anger in it, just the flat, clear recognition of a man who has finally seen the full shape of the thing that has been done to him. Victor Hale looked back, and for the first time since Eliza Ward had stepped off that wagon into the dust of Blackthorn Ridge, she saw Victor Hale look at something he was not certain he could control. He looked at her. She met it the same way she'd been meeting things since she got here, straight on, without flinching, with everything she had. The auction master was calling for order. Pierce was still talking. 3 ranchers were now on their feet, asking questions that Hale's careful announcement had not prepared him to answer in public, in front of people who were no longer uncertain about which way to lean. Gideon, quietly, beside her. "Her voice carries more truth than all the lies you've built." He said it low. Not to the room, not performing it. He said it to her. She didn't answer. She was watching the room do what rooms did when the thing they'd been afraid to see was finally visible. It shifted, and it kept shifting, and the direction it was shifting was not the one Victor Hale had planned for when he'd timed his entrance to command it. It was not over. She knew that. But it had begun, and beginning was what she had come here to do. The room did not resolve itself neatly after Gideon said those words. That was not how rooms worked, and Eliza had not expected it to be. What happened instead was the particular kind of chaos that follows when a thing that has been held in private suddenly becomes public property. Everyone talking at once, the auction master hitting his gavel without much effect, Pierce raising his voice over the noise in the practiced way of a lawyer who understood that volume and authority were not the same thing, but that volume bought time. Victor Hale did not raise his voice. That was the thing she watched, because it told her more than the chaos did. Hale stood at the front of the room and let the noise happen around him and kept his eyes moving. Across the ranchers who were on their feet, across Fitch, across the documents that Bauer was holding up for the people nearest him to see. He was reading the room the way a man read a battlefield, assessing what could still be managed and what had already been lost. He was not panicking. That meant he had something left. She leaned toward Gideon. "He's going to try to reframe it," she said quietly. "Watch." And Hale did. He waited until the noise had peaked and begun, naturally, to subside. People could only sustain that pitch of agitation for so long before they needed to hear something. And then he lifted one hand in a gesture that was somehow both a request for quiet and an assumption of it, and the room gave it to him, which told her something about the 15 years of authority that didn't dissolve in a single afternoon, no matter how much evidence you put in front of people. "I understand there are concerns," Hale said. His voice was measured, reasonable, the voice of a man who had decided the right play was to appear unruffled. "And I welcome the opportunity to address them properly, through the appropriate legal channels, with full documentation, in a setting designed for that process rather than this one." He looked around the room. "What I'd caution against is allowing a few disputed figures and some speculative analysis to disrupt a process that is designed to benefit every landowner in this valley." It was good. She had to give him that. He had turned evidence into disputed figures and legal findings into speculative analysis in 2 sentences, and he'd done it calmly enough that at least 4 people in the room were nodding along before they'd finished processing what he'd actually said. Fitch was already moving. He came forward from the back of the room with his satchel, and he had the look of a man who had anticipated exactly this move and was not impressed by it. "The channels Mr. Hale is referring to," Fitch said, addressing the room rather than Hale directly, "are the same channels that have been processing his consortium's water filings for 3 years without public notification to the affected landowners. I've filed a formal challenge with the Territory Land Office this morning." He reached into his satchel and produced a document, holding it up. "That challenge is based on the deed documentation for Cross Ranch, which I have reviewed in full, and on the survey discrepancy in the consortium's amendment filing, which is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of coordinates that do not match the original grant. The Territory Land Office is required by statute to respond within 30 days. 30 days, someone in the crowd said. And what happens to our water in 30 days? Nothing changes in 30 days, Fitch said. That's the point of the challenge. It freezes the consortium's expansion filing pending review, which means Mr. Hale cannot move forward with the water management structure he described until the territory has adjudicated the original deed question. The man who had spoken, she didn't know him, a rancher from the look of him, 50s, with the kind of face that had been outdoors in all weathers, turned to look at Hale. That true? Hale's lawyer Pierce started to speak. Hale stopped him with a slight movement of his hand. The legal process will proceed as it proceeds, Hale said. I have full confidence in the merits of the consortium's position. That's not an answer, the rancher said. It wasn't. The room noticed. Colby, from where he was standing near the side wall, caught Eliza's eye and gave her the smallest nod, the kind that meant this is going the way it should and also don't relax yet. She didn't. She was watching Hale's face, and she was watching his lawyer, and she was watching the 2 men who had come in with them and who had been, she realized, positioning themselves near the exits for the last 10 minutes in the practiced way of people managing a situation rather than participating in it. Driscoll was not in the room. She had been looking for him since they arrived, and she hadn't found him, and the absence was now more significant than his presence would have been. She touched Gideon's arm. Driscoll isn't here. Gideon scanned the room, his jaw tightened slightly. Patterson, she said. Ask Patterson if Driscoll came in this morning to access the sale records. Gideon moved. She watched him cross the room to where Patterson was standing near the auction registration table, and she watched the brief exchange, and she watched Gideon's face when Patterson answered him. He came back to her side. He was there at 7 this morning, Gideon said, before Patterson opened. Patterson found him at the records when he came in, said he was doing routine verification. 7 in the morning. They had arrived at 9. Whatever Driscoll had done to those records in the 2 hours between 7 and 9, the adjusted sheets they'd photographed in their memory and documented in Fitch's challenge might now look different from what was currently on file. Fitch, she said, and Fitch was close enough to hear the quiet urgency in it. He was beside them in 10 seconds. She told him in 3 sentences. His expression didn't change, but his hand went into his satchel and came out with a folded document that he opened with the deliberate unhurrying of a man who knew what was in it. Certified copies, he said. I had Patterson certify copies of the relevant sales sheets 2 days ago, before we came here. Driscoll changing the originals now doesn't change what was on file when those copies were made. She felt something in her chest release slightly, like a breath she'd been holding without knowing it. You anticipated that, she said. I've seen it before, Fitch said. Men like Hale always have someone who moves the paperwork when the pressure comes. You prepare for it, or you lose to it. He was already turning back toward the room, where the noise had risen again, and the auction master had given up on his gavel and was simply waiting for a natural pause. The formal proceedings wound down without resolution, which was what Eliza had expected. A cattle auction was not a courtroom, and the questions the room was asking, loudly, in the overlapping way of a community that had been sitting on unease for a long time and had finally found a reason to let it out, were not questions that could be answered in an afternoon. What the afternoon accomplished was something different and in some ways more durable. It made the shape of the thing visible to everyone at once, so that Hale could no longer manage who knew what and when. By the time people began moving toward the doors, Eliza had counted 6 ranchers who had spoken directly to Gideon or to Fitch, 3 of whom had brought their own records and wanted to know if the pattern they'd noticed in their cattle sales meant what they thought it meant. It did. She didn't tell them what to feel about it. She just confirmed what they were looking at and pointed them toward Fitch. Margaret Mercer found her near the door. Hale's not going to accept this, Margaret said. No, Eliza agreed. He has more to spend on lawyers than any of us have. He does. Margaret looked at her steadily. You don't look worried. I'm worried, Eliza said. I just don't think worry changes what needs to be done next. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had the look of a woman who had been making decisions without a safety net for long enough that she'd stopped expecting one and had developed a certain respect for others who operated the same way. What needs to be done next? She asked. We need to put everything in front of the Territory Land Office before Hale's lawyers can get there first and frame the argument. Fitch filed the challenge this morning, but a challenge is a beginning, not an end. The Land Office is going to want documentation, testimony, and ideally the participation of every affected landowner in the valley. She looked at Margaret. That means the Bowers, the Mercers, anyone else whose sale records show the same pattern. Individually, we're a dispute. Together, we're evidence of a scheme. Margaret nodded slowly. I'll talk to the others on the Western Ridge. There are 3 families there who've been selling through Driscoll for the last 2 years. Would they come forward? If they understood what was happening to them? Yes. She paused. People aren't cowards because they're afraid. They're cowards because they don't know there's a door. Eliza thought about that on the ride home. Hale's response came faster than she'd expected, and it came in a form she hadn't fully anticipated. 2 days after the auction, a notice appeared at the Blackthorn Ridge post office, filed with the Territory Clerk's office, asserting that the public presentation of the challenge documents had constituted defamation and that Victor Hale and the Blackthorn Valley Water and Land Consortium were pursuing damages against the parties responsible. The parties named were Emery Fitch, Hendrik Bauer, and Eliza Cross. Not Gideon. Her. She read the notice at the post office counter, with Patterson watching her from the corner of his eye and trying to appear as if he wasn't. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. You want to send a telegraph? Patterson asked. Not yet, she said. She rode back to the ranch with the notice in her pocket and the cold coming down from the mountain with its usual lack of sentiment, and she tried to think about what it meant strategically rather than personally. Naming her specifically was a message. Hale was telling Gideon that involving his wife had a cost, and he was doing it in the most direct way available to him, which was to make her the target. It was designed to make Gideon pull back, to make the choice between the ranch's legal fight and his wife's exposure feel like a choice that had to be made. It also told her something. Men who were confident in their position didn't file defamation notices 2 days after a public meeting. They waited, built their case, came at you when they were ready. Hale had moved quickly because the auction room had rattled him more than he'd shown, and quick moves from rattled people had edges that careful moves didn't. She told Gideon that evening. He read the notice with the flatness that was his version of controlled anger, and when he finished, he set it on the table and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. He named you, Gideon said. Yes. Not me. He's trying to make you choose between fighting him and protecting me from the exposure. She kept her voice even. Which means he thinks you'll choose protecting me, because that's what he thinks men like you do. Men like me, Gideon repeated. Men who have something to lose personally. He's betting that's a stronger pressure than whatever legal case we're building. She met his eyes. He's wrong. Gideon looked at her for a long time. The fire was doing its usual work in the stove, and Ranger was doing his usual work on the floor, and outside the wind was finding its usual angles on the north wall. And it was, Eliza thought, a remarkably ordinary-feeling moment to be sitting in the middle of something that could take everything they'd built apart. If this goes badly, Gideon said carefully, the defamation claim could be used to challenge anything we've presented. Make it look like we fabricated. We didn't fabricate anything. I know that. Fitch knows that. The certified copies are dated before the auction. Whatever Driscoll changed in the originals doesn't touch the copies. She paused. The defamation claim has no teeth, Gideon, but it has noise, and noise is what he's going for. He wants the Territory Land Office to see a contested mess instead of a clear fraud. Can Fitch hold the challenge together against that? Fitch has been doing this for 30 years. He held a water rights case together against a mining consortium with 4 times Hale's resources. She folded her hands on the table. We need to respond to the defamation notice by filing a counter with the Territory Clerk, formally, in writing, denying the claim and submitting the documentation that supports everything presented at the auction. Fitch is already drafting it. He needs your signature and Bauer's by the end of the week. And yours? And mine. Another silence. Gideon reached out and pulled the notice back toward him, looked at it once more, and then pushed it to the edge of the table with the deliberate motion of someone setting something aside that they are done letting occupy the center of their attention. "All right," he said. The week that followed was the kind of week that left marks. Fitch worked from the boarding house and from the Cross Ranch kitchen table in roughly equal measure, producing documents with a speed and precision that Eliza found genuinely impressive and that Colby found deeply unsettling, because Colby had a cowboy's suspicion of men who worked primarily with paper, and Fitch had shown no particular interest in changing that impression. 3 more ranchers came forward with their sale records, all showing the same adjusted figures, all verified by the same initials. One of them, a man named Garrett, who ran sheep on the South Ridge and had not spoken to Gideon Cross in 6 years over a fence line dispute, appeared at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with his records under his arm and a look on his face that suggested he had opinions about the fence line, but had decided they were currently less important. "My spring sale was short by 12%, Garrett said. He dropped the records on the kitchen table without ceremony. "I thought the market was down." "The market wasn't down," Eliza said. Garrett looked at her. He was a lean, weathered man with no apparent interest in pleasantries. "What do you need from me?" "Your signature on a testimony document that Fitch is preparing. It'll go to the Territory Land Office with the others." "Gideon know I'm here?" "He will." Garrett nodded. He sat down and waited for the document with the patience of a man who had made his decision and was done reconsidering it. Gideon came in from the south pasture an hour later and found Garrett at his kitchen table. The 2 men looked at each other across 6 years of silence, and something moved between them that was too complicated and too private for anyone else in the room to interpret. "Garrett," Gideon said. "Gideon," Garrett said. That was all. Garrett signed the document, stood up, collected his records, and left. Gideon watched him go and then looked at Eliza with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not quite gratitude, not quite wonder, something closer to the careful recalibration of a man who had been living inside a story about his own isolation for so long that evidence against it landed strangely. "The fence line," he started. "Not today," Eliza said. "One thing at a time." He almost smiled. She'd learned to notice the versions of it that didn't reach his face fully. The slight change around his eyes, the fractional ease in the set of his shoulders. She noticed it now and said nothing about it, because some things were better left at their natural size. Hale's lawyers filed a motion on Thursday to have Fitch's challenge dismissed on procedural grounds, specifically that Fitch, as a retired adjudicator rather than a licensed territory attorney, lacked standing to file the challenge in the first place. It was a good move. She had to keep acknowledging that Hale made good moves. Fitch read the motion and handed it back to Colby, who had ridden to town to retrieve it, without any change in his expression. "He's not wrong about the standing question," Fitch said. "I anticipated it. The challenge was co-filed with Thomas Crane, who is a licensed territory attorney. His name is on the second line of the document, which Pierce apparently chose not to read past the first." Colby looked at the document, then at Fitch. "You set that up ahead of time." "I've been doing this for 30 years, Fitch said, which was the same thing he'd said to Eliza after the certified copies, and was apparently his complete explanation for most of what he did. Colby handed the document back. "When does the land office rule?" "On the standing question within 10 days. On the challenge itself within 30 of that." Fitch put the motion in his satchel. "In the meantime, the expansion filing remains frozen. 10 days, then 30. They were deep into November now, and winter had stopped being a promise and become a fact. The mornings were hard, the work was relentless, and Eliza had added the management of the legal correspondence to the management of the household accounts and the cattle records and the ongoing effort to understand a ranch that revealed new complications with the regularity of a place that had been under sustained pressure for 2 years and had held together on the strength of the people running it rather than the margin they were operating with. She was tired in a way she'd stopped announcing to herself because announcing it didn't help and there wasn't an alternative. She kept working. On the 4th evening after the motion, she came in from helping Pete with the evening feeding. One of the hands had gone down with a bad knee, and Pete was managing more than he should at his age. and she found Gideon sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in his hand and the look of a man who'd just been told something that had rearranged his interior. She sat down across from him. "From the Territory Land Office," he said. He set the letter on the table between them. "The challenge has been accepted for full review. They're sending an adjudicator." She looked at the letter. "Official territory header, the formal language of bureaucracy in motion." "When?" she asked. 3 weeks. They'll want to meet with all the affected landowners and review the documentation in person." 3 weeks. Winter, deepening. An official adjudicator coming into the valley to look at everything they had and everything Hale had and make a determination that would carry the weight of territory law. "Does Hale know?" she asked. "He'll have gotten the same notice." She thought about Hale reading that letter, about what his next move would be, given that the procedural motion had failed and the challenge was moving forward, and he had an adjudicator coming who would have access to everything: certified copies, original documentation, testimony from 6 affected ranchers across the valley. "He's going to try to settle," she said. Gideon looked at her. "Not with you," she said. "With the land office. He'll try to get ahead of the adjudicator by offering a modified version of the consortium plan, something that looks like a concession but preserves the core of what he's trying to do." She turned the letter toward herself. "He might offer to withdraw the water rights amendment and reframe it as a voluntary management proposal, something the Valley ranchers would have to opt into." "Why would that be better for him?" "Because an opt-in proposal isn't fraud. It's a business arrangement. And if he can reframe the fraud as a misunderstanding and the water theft as a voluntary program before the adjudicator arrives, the territory review becomes a much murkier thing." She looked at the letter. The auction manipulation would still be a separate issue, but separating it from the water rights dispute takes half his exposure off the table. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You think he can do that in 3 weeks?" "I think he'll try, which means we need the adjudicator to understand the full picture before Hale's lawyers can present a modified picture." She paused. "Fitch needs to be in contact with the Territory Land Office before the adjudicator arrives. Get them the full documentation, all 6 sets of sale records, the certified copies, the consortium filing history. Everything, in sequence, so the shape of it is visible before anyone else starts redrawing the lines." Gideon picked up the letter again. He read it a second time, the way he read most things, carefully, looking for the specific weight of each word. "The adjudicator's name is on the 3rd line," he said. She looked. "A woman named Clara Holt, appointed by the Territory Land Office 6 months ago out of Santa Fe." She had no way of knowing what that meant, but she filed it away. "I'll talk to Fitch in the morning," she said. Well, Fitch already knew. He had, characteristically, already drafted the preliminary documentation package for Clara Holt's review and had, also characteristically, been waiting for Gideon to receive the official notice before mentioning it. "Did you think he wouldn't tell me?" Eliza asked. "I thought he might need a day to sit with it," Fitch said. "Men like Gideon Cross don't always move immediately to action. They have to locate themselves in a situation before they can move. I found it's better to let that happen on its own schedule." She looked at him. "How long have you been watching people locate themselves in situations?" "Long enough to know it when I see it." He handed her the draft package. "Tell me if I've missed anything." She went through it carefully. He had not missed anything. He had, in fact, included 2 pieces of documentation she hadn't thought to include: a timeline of the consortium's filing activity mapped against the periods of lowest cattle sale returns for the affected properties, and a copy of the auction house's own procedural rules, which made clear that verification initials in the sale column constituted legal attestation of the amounts recorded. "The attestation rule is the important one," Fitch said. "Driscoll can't claim clerical error once you establish that the initials are a legal attestation. A clerical error in a legally attested document is not an error, it's a falsification." "Will the territory adjudicator understand that distinction?" Clara Holt spent 4 years in the territory solicitor's office before she moved to the land office, Fitch said. "She'll understand it." Eliza handed the package back. "Send it." He sent it. The letter from Hale came 6 days later. It came to Gideon, not through a lawyer, but in Hale's own handwriting. She recognized the hand from the letters she'd seen in Gideon's files, the careful script of a man who took some pride in his correspondence. He was proposing a private meeting, just the 2 of them, before the adjudicator arrived. He wanted to discuss a resolution that would benefit the valley without requiring the territory to become involved in what was, at its core, a local matter. Gideon read the letter. He handed it to Eliza. She read it. She handed it to Fitch, who had been present for dinner. He'd been eating at the ranch more than the boarding house lately, drawn by what she suspected was as much the quality of the food as the proximity to the work. Fitch read it, folded it, handed it back. "Don't go," Fitch said. "I wasn't planning to," Gideon said. "Good. A private meeting lets him make an offer that you'd have to either accept or reject without documentation. Whatever he proposes in private becomes your word against his about the terms. If he has anything genuine to offer, he can offer it through proper channels with both sets of lawyers present and everything in writing." Gideon nodded. He took the letter back and looked at it once more. "He's nervous." "He's calculating," Fitch said. "There's a difference. Nervous men act badly. Calculating men make offers." "What's the offer going to be?" Colby asked from across the table. He'd developed a habit, over the past weeks, of being present for these conversations without always announcing himself. Not eavesdropping exactly, more like a man who had decided this was his business and had stopped pretending otherwise. "He'll offer to drop the defamation claim," Eliza said, "and probably withdraw the consortium's expansion filing voluntarily, in exchange for Gideon agreeing not to pursue the auction fraud through the territory. Essentially buying his way out of the criminal exposure," Fitch said. "Would that be enough?" Pete asked. He was at the stove, which was where he usually was, and he asked it the way he asked most things, quietly, without drama, with the genuine curiosity of a man who understood that other people had information he didn't and saw no shame in asking for it. Fitch looked at Pete. "For the ranch, possibly. The water rights would be secured, the defamation claim gone, the consortium stopped. Gideon's operation would be on solid footing." "But," Pete said, "but Driscoll would still be working the auction house, and Hale would still be operating in the valley. And the ranchers who aren't in this room, who signed on with Driscoll last year or the year before, and haven't compared their numbers to what they should have been, they'd still be losing money they don't know they're losing." The kitchen was quiet. Colby was looking at the table. Pete was looking at the stove. Gideon was looking at Eliza. She looked back at him. "We don't accept the private offer," she said. "We let the adjudicator come. We put all of it in front of her, the water rights, the auction manipulation, everything. And we let the territory process do what it's designed to do." "Even if that's harder," Gideon said, "especially then." He nodded once. It wasn't agreement for her benefit. He had already been there, she suspected, and was simply confirming it aloud for the room. "I'll draft the reply to Hale," Fitch said. "Formal, through proper channels. Decline the private meeting. Suggest he direct any further communication to his legal representatives." He left to write it. The kitchen settled back into its ordinary rhythm. Pete moving to the stove, Colby pushing back from the table. Ranger doing something in his sleep that involved his legs moving as if he were running somewhere important. Eliza began stacking the dishes from dinner. Gideon stood up. He picked up 3 of the dishes she hadn't reached yet and carried them to the sink without comment, which was so unlike the Gideon Cross who had met her at the fence 3 months ago that for a moment she almost said something about it. She didn't. She ran the water, and he set the dishes in the basin, and they worked beside each other in the way of people who have moved past performing their arrangement and arrived somewhere quieter and more honest. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. Outside, the winter was doing what winter did in this valley, pressing in from all sides with the flat determination of a force that did not negotiate. Inside, the fire held, the ranch held. The case they had built, document by document, testimony by testimony, across the coldest and most precise months of Eliza Ward's adult life, held together in a leather satchel in a boarding house room across town, waiting for a woman named Clara Holt to arrive from Santa Fe and see it whole. It was, she thought, almost enough to be doing something that mattered. She washed the dishes. Gideon dried them without being asked. Ranger woke from his running dream and thumped his tail twice against the floor and went back to sleep. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was closer than she'd expected to find in a place that had laughed at her when she arrived, and she was not too proud to acknowledge that, quietly, to herself, in the ordinary warmth of a kitchen that she had spent 3 months making into something that worked. Clara Holt arrived on a Tuesday, which was ordinary enough, but she arrived on horseback rather than by wagon, which told Eliza something before the woman had said a word. She was perhaps 50, compact and efficient in her movements, with the kind of face that had stopped trying to signal anything in particular a long time ago and had settled into simple attentiveness. She wore a good coat and practical boots, and carried a satchel that was, if anything, larger than Fitch's. She tied her horse at the Cross Ranch post herself, without looking around for assistance, and walked to the door and knocked with the knock of someone who was here to work and would like to begin. Gideon opened the door. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I'm Clara Holt. I'd like to start with the original deed documentation if you have it available." That was her greeting. Eliza, from the kitchen doorway, decided she approved. They worked for 3 days at the Cross Ranch kitchen table before moving to the Bower property, then the Mercer land, then 2 of the other affected ranches, and then finally to Blackthorn Ridge itself, where Holt met with Patterson, reviewed the auction records, and spent 45 minutes with the certified copies that Fitch had made before Driscoll's 7 in the morning visit to the originals. She compared them without comment. She made notes. She was not a woman who narrated her conclusions while she was forming them, which Eliza understood and Colby found maddening. "Can you tell what she thinks?" Colby asked on the second evening, after Holt had retired to the boarding house. "No," Eliza said. "Fitch can probably tell." "Fitch won't say." Colby made a sound of deep dissatisfaction and went to check on the horses, which was what he did when the situation was out of his hands and he needed to be useful somewhere. Hale's lawyer, Pierce, requested a formal meeting with Holt on the 4th day. She granted him 1 hour. Eliza didn't know what was said in it. What she knew was that afterward, Holt spent 2 additional hours with Fitch's documentation timeline, the one that mapped the consortium's filing activity against the periods of lowest sale returns, and that when she emerged from the boarding house room she had set the timeline aside. Eliza found her own hands were not entirely steady. It was the waiting. She could manage most things, but waiting, while someone else held the outcome of everything you'd spent months building, was a specific kind of hard that she'd never found a technique for. Gideon found her on the porch that evening, which was unusual because the evenings were genuinely cold now, and nobody stood on the porch voluntarily. He came out with 2 cups of coffee, handed her one without comment, and stood beside her looking at the valley. The valley was winter quiet, pale grass, dark mountains, the creek running lower than it should, but still running. The cattle were in the near pasture, visible as shapes in the last of the light. Somewhere across the valley, in the large house that sat on a rise above the western ridge, Victor Hale was probably doing exactly what she was doing, waiting and thinking about what the waiting meant. "She'll have something by Friday," Gideon said. "Fitch thinks so too." "What do you think?" She wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was too hot to drink yet, but the warmth was useful. "I think we showed her everything we have, and it's enough. I think the question isn't whether she sees the fraud. She's seen it. Those certified copies are unambiguous. The question is what the territory is willing to do about a man who's been operating here for 15 years and has connections in the land office going back nearly as long." Gideon was quiet. "That's the part you can't document," she said. "Whether the institution that's supposed to fix this has been bent long enough that fixing it requires bending back. And if it has been?" She thought about it honestly. "Then we have a longer fight, and we fight it." He looked at her sideways. Not the measuring look of the early weeks, something that had moved past measurement into something less guarded. "You sound like you've been preparing for that possibility for a while," he said. "Since about the 2nd week," she said, "when I understood what we were actually dealing with." He nodded, drank his coffee. The valley went darker and the first stars came out over the eastern ridge, which were the sharpest stars she'd ever seen. Altitude did that, she'd learned, made the sky more itself. "I didn't make this easy," Gideon said. "Not an apology exactly, more like an accounting." "No," she agreed. "The account book. Not meeting you at the Ridge Road. I managed. I know you managed. That's not the same as it being right." He was looking at the valley, not at her, which was how he managed most things that required honesty. "I had a version of what a mail-order bride was going to be, and you weren't it. And instead of adjusting, I waited to see what I'd do," she said. "Yes. That's not the worst thing a person can do," she said. "I've met people who didn't wait, who decided from the first minute and never revisited it." She thought about the street in Blackthorn Ridge, the laughter, Victor Hale's voice carrying across the crowd. Waiting isn't the problem. It's what you decide when you're done waiting. He turned to look at her then. full on, which was still not something he did casually. I decided right, he said. It was the closest thing to a declaration she suspected she was going to get from Gideon Cross, and she found that it was, in fact, enough. Yes, she said, you did. They stood in the cold a little longer, not speaking, which was fine. Some silences were empty and some had content to them, and this one had the particular content of two people who had arrived at an understanding through difficulty rather than ease, and were taking a moment to acknowledge that without making a production of it. Ranger appeared at the door and looked at them both with the expression of a dog who found human behavior confusing but was committed to proximity anyway. They went inside. Clara Holt delivered her preliminary findings on Friday morning at the Blackthorn Ridge Meeting Hall, with every affected landowner present, and Hale's lawyer Pierce at one end of the long table, and Fitch at the other, and Gideon and Eliza in the middle. Hale himself came. She had wondered if he would. He sat at the far end of the table from Gideon, in a good coat, with the controlled composure of a man who had decided that composure was the last thing he had full authority over and was going to hold it regardless. Holt stood at the head of the table with a document in front of her and read from it in the flat, precise voice of a woman who had learned that delivering difficult findings clearly was a form of respect for everyone in the room. The Blackthorn Valley Water and Land Consortium's amendment filing, she said, had been submitted against survey coordinates that did not correspond to the water source described in the original Cross Ranch deed. The discrepancy was not ambiguous. The amendment was therefore invalid as grounds for any claim against the Cross Ranch water rights, and her recommendation to the Territory Land Office was that the filing be formally invalidated and the original deed rights confirmed. Pierce started to speak. Holt looked at him, and he stopped. The auction house sale records, she continued, showed a consistent pattern of adjusted verification across 3 properties over a minimum of 2 years. The adjustments had been initialed by Daniel H. Driscoll in his capacity as auction representative, and those initials constituted legal attestation under territory auction law. The discrepancy between attested amounts and the amounts supported by independent cattle registry records, she cited Fitch's documentation by name, was not within the range of clerical error. Her recommendation was referral to the Territory Solicitor's Office for formal investigation. She put down the document. The room was quiet in the way of rooms that have just received information they needed and are processing the weight of it. These are preliminary findings, Holt said. Final determination rests with the Territory Land Office, which will act on my report within 60 days. In the meantime, the consortium's expansion filing remains frozen, and I am recommending an immediate suspension of Daniel Driscoll's auction verification authority pending the solicitor's investigation. Pierce leaned forward. The consortium will be appealing. The appeal process is available to you, Holt said, through proper channels in writing to the Territory Land Office. I'd suggest you begin that process with a surveyor who can independently verify the coordinates question, since that is the foundation of the consortium's claim and the coordinates do not support it. She said it without particular satisfaction. It was simply what was true, and she had the manner of someone for whom that distinction between what you felt about the truth and what the truth was had been established a long time ago. Victor Hale had not spoken. He had not moved. I was looking at the table in front of him with an expression that was still controlled, still composed, but had something underneath it now that had not been there when he'd walked in. Something that looked, if you were watching carefully enough, like a man who had finally arrived at the edge of the territory he controlled and was looking at what was on the other side. He looked up. Across the table, across the distance of everything that had happened in the last 4 months, he looked at Eliza. She held it the same way she'd been holding things since October. Straight, without performance, with the simple steadiness of a woman who had done what she'd come to do and was not going to dress it up as anything other than what it was. Hale stood. He buttoned his coat. He looked at Pierce and made a minimal gesture that meant they were leaving, and Pierce gathered his papers with the efficient movements of a man who had expected a longer meeting and was recalibrating. At the door, Hale paused. He didn't turn around. "Mrs. Cross," he said. She waited. He didn't say anything else. He went out. The room exhaled. Hendrik Bauer, across the table, let out a long breath and rubbed his face with both hands. Margaret Mercer sat very still for a moment and then nodded once to herself, the way people nodded when something they'd been afraid to believe was confirmed. The other ranchers did what people did after high tension, shifted in their seats, exchanged looks,
said things to each other that were mostly just sound, the human need to mark a moment with noise. Fitch was making notes. He would be making notes for the next 2 hours, she suspected. He was the kind of man who understood that a preliminary finding was a beginning and that every beginning required its own careful documentation.
Colby came through from the side of the room where he'd been standing. He never sat at these things if he could help it, always placed himself somewhere he could see the whole space. And he stopped beside Eliza and looked at the table and then at her. "So," he said. "So," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Colby Hayes had a particular relationship with words that he'd valued in proportion to their scarcity, and what he said next he said without his usual armor of skepticism. "You know what the first thing I thought was when you showed up in that wagon?" "I can imagine." "Probably not exactly." He looked at the wall. "I thought, this is one more person Gideon's going to have to watch leave." He'd had three women who came and decided they couldn't handle it and left. And each one, he didn't say anything, but each one made him a little more certain that the problem was the ranch or the situation or his manner. He paused. It wasn't. The problem was that the wrong people kept arriving. She didn't say anything. This was the kind of thing you let a person finish. "I wasn't wrong to be cautious," he said. "But I was wrong about you specifically, and I knew it about 3 weeks in, and I kept being difficult anyway because I didn't want to just concede it." He looked at her. "So, that's what that was about." "I know," she said. "I figured you did." "You told me about Patterson's records," she said, "and about Emery Fitch, when it mattered." He shrugged. "Wasn't charity." "No," she agreed. "It was judgment. That's better." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the structural adjustment that happened in people's faces when they'd been holding something tense for a long time and finally let it go. Gideon appeared at her shoulder. He'd been speaking with Fitch, and the look on his face had the particular quality of a man whose immediate future had just changed shape and who was still taking the measure of the new shape. "Fitch says the territory solicitor's referral is the stronger outcome," Gideon said. "The water rights were always going to come down our way, given the deed. The solicitor's investigation means Driscoll loses his auction standing and the consortium gets formal scrutiny. That's what makes it stick." "It means Hale doesn't just regroup and try a different angle," Eliza said. "Yes." She looked around the room, at Bauer, who was talking to one of the other ranchers with the focused energy of a man who had been waiting to have this conversation for years, at Margaret Mercer, who had produced from somewhere a small notebook and was writing in it with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already moved on to what needed to happen next, at Patterson, in the corner, who caught her eye and gave her the small, serious nod of a man who had been keeping records his whole life in the belief that records mattered and had just watched that belief confirmed. This was what it looked like when a thing that had been bent slowly came back. Not dramatic, not clean. People in a room, tired, slightly stunned, already thinking about what they had to do next. The ordinary texture of a hard thing that had been seen through. She had expected to feel more, maybe. What she felt instead was something quieter, a settling, like the way a house adjusted to a cold night and went still. The Territory Land Office delivered its final determination 47 days later, which was faster than Fitch had expected, and which he attributed, without particular sentimentality, to the quality of the documentation package he'd assembled. The consortium's water amendment filing was formally invalidated. The Cross Ranch water rights were confirmed in their original terms, with a notation in the official record that established the precedent for the other valley properties as well. The territory solicitor opened a formal investigation into Daniel Driscoll, which resulted, before the spring, in the revocation of his auction verification license and a civil settlement that included restitution payments to the 6 affected ranches based on the calculated discrepancies across the documented years. The restitution from Cross Ranch alone was not a fortune. It was enough to replace the Southgate wagon and repair the barn roof and keep the cattle operation running through a season that would otherwise have been tight. Eliza put the numbers in the account book in her own handwriting because she kept the accounts now, and she kept them the way she kept everything, carefully, with attention to what the numbers actually said rather than what you might prefer them to say. Victor Hale did not leave the valley. She hadn't expected him to. Men like Hale didn't leave. They recalculated. The consortium was dissolved quietly in the way of legal structures that have become liabilities. Pierce stopped appearing in Blackthorn Ridge. The two men who had positioned themselves near the exits at the auction came and went less visibly. Hale himself was still present, still the largest landowner on the western ridge, still attended the functions that required attendance. But the space around him had changed in the way that spaces changed around men, when the thing they'd been using to hold authority was taken away. He was still powerful. He was no longer uncontested. She did not feel triumphant about this. Triumph required a cleaner ending than the one life generally provided. What she felt was something more like the satisfaction of a problem correctly identified and adequately addressed, which was its own kind of thing, and she'd decided a worthy one. Driscoll left. That she felt something about a plain, unglamorous relief that the man who had been quietly stealing from these families for years was no longer in a position to keep doing it. She didn't spend much time on the feeling. She had accounts to keep. Spring came to the valley the way spring came to high-altitude places, reluctantly, and then all at once. The creek ran full again. The cattle were moved to the south pasture. Pete's knees gave him trouble every morning for the first 2 weeks of the new season, and then eased, which Pete attributed to the weather, and Eliza suspected had more to do with the fact that she'd stopped letting him take the early feeding rounds alone. She and Gideon rode out to the eastern property line on a morning in late April, not for any particular purpose. She'd wanted to see the creek at full flow, because she'd spent so much of the winter thinking about it in the abstract, as a number in a deed document and a line on a survey map, that she found herself wanting to see it as a physical thing. It was wider than she'd imagined, louder. The snowmelt had it running fast over the rocks on the eastern side, and the sound of it filled the air in a way that she understood, standing there, was exactly why men would scheme and steal and spend years in legal maneuvering to control it. Water in a dry land was not a resource. It was the thing everything else grew from. Gideon sat his horse beside her and didn't say anything for a while. "Fitch is leaving next week," she said. She'd heard from him the day before. A letter, formal but not impersonal, saying that his business in the valley was concluded and he intended to return to Fort Ridge. "I know. I've asked him to stay on as a consultant. Retainer arrangement." She looked at him. "You didn't mention that." "I'm mentioning it now." "He agreed?" "He'll ride up twice a year, more if we need him." Gideon looked at the creek. "I should have had someone like him 2 years ago, before Hale got the settlement arrangement going." "You didn't know what you were dealing with 2 years ago." "I knew something was wrong." "Knowing something is wrong and knowing what it is and knowing what to do about it are 3 different things," she said. "Most people stop at the first." He looked at her. "You didn't." "I had less to lose by looking," she said. "When you've already lost the thing that grounded you, you get less careful about what rocks you turn over. You stop being afraid of what you'll find because the worst thing you could find is just more information." It was the most she'd said about the farm in Pennsylvania since she'd arrived, and she said it the way she said most things about it, without self-pity, because self-pity was a weight she'd decided she wasn't going to carry if she could help it, and she'd mostly managed. The loss was still there. It was just in its right place now, behind her rather than in front of her. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you came," he said. It was a simple sentence, and he said it simply, without the construction most people built around vulnerable sentences to protect themselves from the exposure of having said them. She appreciated that. "So am I," she said. The creek ran and the horses stood patient in the spring cold, and somewhere up the ridge, a hawk was doing something effortless, and they watched it for a while without talking, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said that hadn't already been said, or was better left to the ordinary and continuous language of 2 people who had decided to share a life and were finding out day by day what that meant in practice. It meant work. Mostly it meant work, but it meant other things too. Colby Hayes, in June, rode over to the Garrett property to discuss the fence line that had been a dispute between Garrett and Gideon for 6 years, and he came back having settled it in an afternoon. He reported this at dinner with the slightly defensive air of a man who was not sure how to present having done something unexpectedly useful. "It wasn't complicated," he said. "The line was wrong and they both knew it. They just needed someone who wasn't either of them to say it out loud." Pete, who had been eating his dinner with the patience of someone waiting for the correct moment, said, "You could have done that 6 years ago." "I know," Colby said. "Why didn't you?" Colby thought about it. "I didn't think it was my place." And now you do? Another pause. Colby Hayes was not a man who was quick with honest self-assessment. He came at it from angles, the way you came at something you weren't sure would hold your weight. I think, he started, stopped. I think watching someone come in from outside and do things that the people here had been telling themselves weren't their place to do, and watching it work, it changed what I thought my place was. Pete nodded. That was all. He went back to his dinner. Eliza looked at the table and did not say anything, because what Colby had just described was something she understood from the inside, and that words generally made worse rather than better. She'd learned that about certain kinds of change. They didn't need commentary. They were just true, and you let them be. On a Tuesday in late summer, a woman appeared at the gate of Cross Ranch with a worn bag and a letter of inquiry. She was young, 20, maybe 22, with red hair and the look of someone who had been traveling and was trying not to show how tired she was. She was looking for work, she said. She'd heard that Cross Ranch was well-run and honest in its dealings, and she was good with livestock and could cook and was willing to do whatever was needed. Eliza answered the door. She looked at the young woman for a moment, at the bag, which had a strap repaired with mismatched thread, and at the eyes, which were trying to appear confident and revealing themselves as uncertain, and at the set of her shoulders, which was the set of someone who had been told too many times what she couldn't do and was choosing, right now, to stand at a stranger's door and ask for something anyway. "Come in," Eliza said. "We'll talk it over." The young woman, her name was Rose, she said, when she'd sat down at the kitchen table, looked around at the kitchen with the particular attention of someone reading a space for what it could tell you. The organized shelves, the account book on the counter, Ranger under the table, the solid warmth of a fire that had been properly banked. "Is there work?" Rose asked. "There's always work," Eliza said. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. "Tell me what you can do." She listened, and she did not decide anything about the young woman before she'd finished speaking, and she did not make the young woman's size or appearance or history part of the calculus. And when she had heard everything, she made a judgment based on what she'd actually heard. She hired her. It was, she would think later, the most natural thing she'd done in a long time. You saw what a person was. You made room for it. That was all. That was really the whole of it. There was a moment, she didn't plan for it, didn't expect it, that happened on a September evening, almost a full year after she'd stepped off that wagon into Victor Hale's public cruelty. She and Gideon were riding back from the northern pasture, where they'd spent the afternoon dealing with a fence repair that had been more complicated than anticipated, and had left them both dirty and tired and mildly irritated with the fence and with each other, because even people who have arrived at genuine partnership have afternoons that go wrong and express it in the tired shorthand of 2 people who are close enough to take their frustration somewhere safe. They had not spoken for the last mile of the ride, which was the silence of the aftermath of a small argument rather than the comfortable silence of earlier in the year, and Eliza was thinking about whether she needed to say something or whether they were past the point where things needed to be said. They came over the last rise, and the ranch came into view below them. The low house, the barn, the smoke from the kitchen where Rose was probably starting the evening meal, the cattle in the near pasture, the creek glinting in the last of the afternoon light. Gideon pulled up without any particular reason and looked at it. She pulled up beside him and looked at it too. It was not remarkable, as views went. It was a working ranch at the end of a difficult season, showing the wear of use rather than the polish of prosperity. The barn needed paint on the east side. The south fence was still a work in progress. The account book would show a year that had been better than the 2 before it, and not as good as she intended next year to be. But the creek ran on their land in the terms of the deed that had always been theirs. The cattle count was the best it had been in 3 years. The account book was honest. The people in that house, Pete with his careful joints, Colby with his recalibrated sense of his own place, Rose who was turning out to be exactly what she'd said she was, were there because the ranch had come through the thing that had been trying to quietly kill it, and had come through because the right things had been done with the right information at the right time. None of it was luck. It wasn't destiny either. It was work and attention and the willingness to look at what was actually there rather than the version of it that was easier to see. Gideon looked at her. The small argument from earlier was still somewhere between them, but it was in its right proportion now. the size of a small argument between two people who would have 1,000 more of them, and not one of those arguments would be the thing that defined them. "I need to fix the east side of the barn before winter," he said. "I know," she said. "I put it in the schedule last week." He almost smiled. "Of course you did." They rode down to the ranch. What Eliza Ward learned over the course of that year in Blackthorn Ridge. And she had been a person who learned by doing rather than by being told. So this knowledge came through her hands and her tired mornings, and her months of sitting with account books and legal documents, and the specific quality of patience required to wait for things to become visible, was something she wouldn't have been able to articulate when she arrived, and could only partially articulate now. It was this, that the people who got to decide who you were before you'd opened your mouth were not deciding anything about you. They were deciding something about themselves, about the limits of their own vision, the smallness of what they were willing to see. Victor Hale's cruelty on that street had nothing to do with what Eliza Ward was. It was a declaration of what Victor Hale was, and what the people who laughed with him were, and none of it required her to become smaller in response. She had not come to Blackthorn Ridge to prove anything to those people. She had come because she had nothing left in the east and something possible in the west. And she had followed the possible thing with the same directness she brought to everything, because that was the person she was, and she had stopped apologizing for it somewhere around the time her family's farm was taken away, and she'd understood that the world was not going to give her the version of herself she'd been waiting for permission to become. You became it. You did the work. You looked at what was actually there, even when what was actually there was hard and complicated and connected to things you hadn't expected to find. You put one thing next to another thing until the shape of the truth was visible, and then you stood up in a room full of people and said what you'd found, not because you were certain of the outcome, but because saying it was the right thing, and you had run out of patience for the alternative. She had arrived with a bag and a determination that people had mistaken for stubbornness, which was understandable, because from the outside they looked the same. The difference was internal. Stubbornness was holding on because you didn't know how to let go. What she had was something else, the specific quality of a person who had looked at their options honestly and chosen the hard one because the hard one was the one that was worth something. A year later, she kept the accounts for Cross Ranch and had begun, quietly, to help two of the neighboring ranches understand their own numbers in ways that protected them from the kind of gradual theft that had nearly destroyed Gideon's operation. She was not paid for this. She did it because it needed doing and she could do it, which were, she had decided, sufficient reasons for most things. Gideon was still quiet, still difficult in the specific ways that particular people were difficult. Not cruel, never cruel, but closed off in the directions where he'd been hurt and stubborn, in the ways that men who had run things alone for a long time became stubborn. They had learned each other's limits and argued against them sometimes and respected them other times and got it wrong in both directions often enough to keep things honest. It was not the marriage she might have imagined if she'd spent her girlhood imagining marriages, which she hadn't, because she'd been keeping farm accounts and learning cattle and paying attention to the things that would actually matter. It was the marriage she had, and it was real, which was worth more than the imagined version in all the ways that counted. The valley knew her name by then, not as a curiosity, not as the joke bride who'd somehow lasted. They knew her as the person you went to when you needed to understand what your numbers meant, or when you had a document you didn't trust and needed someone to look at it without an agenda. She had built that reputation the same way she'd built everything else, one thing at a time, without announcement, by doing the work until the work spoke for itself. Ranger was getting old. He moved more slowly these days, and the ear that had never stood up now drooped further than it used to, and he had developed preferences about which side of the stove he slept on that he communicated with a patience that suggested he expected them to be honored. They were. There was a version of her life where she had not written that letter, where she had read the advertisement in the newspaper and set it aside, and found some other arrangement, some smaller space, something safer and more predictable. She sometimes thought about that version of herself, not with judgment, but with a kind of wondering. That version of herself had not been wrong to be afraid. Fear was a reasonable response to genuine uncertainty, but you couldn't build anything in the space that fear kept clear for you. Al built things by moving into the uncertain space anyway, by being willing to not know how it turned out while you were in the middle of deciding it, by trusting that the work you were doing was worth doing even when the outcome wasn't visible yet. She had moved into the uncertain space. She had done the work. And here, in this kitchen, with its organized shelves and its honest account book and its old dog beside the stove and the sound of the valley going about its life outside the window, here was what the work had made. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was hers.